I was standing in the hallway of our Calgary home, 7 months pregnant, holding a grocery bag that had just split open at the bottom, oranges rolling across the hardwood floor in every direction. I remember thinking what a ridiculous metaphor that was, my life literally spilling apart at my feet. That was the moment my husband bent down to pick up an orange, straightened up, and said in a clear and easy voice, "I'll get those, sweetheart." I stood there while the last orange rolled under the radiator. My husband, who had been living with progressive MS for the 6 years I'd known him, who trembled in cold weather, who held his coffee mug with both hands every morning, who I had reorganized my entire life around, had just moved across the hallway in one fluid, effortless motion and spoken, without so much as a hint of the fatigue that was supposed to define his every waking hour. I'm 63 years old now. My granddaughter is asleep in the next room as I tell you this. And I've learned that some stories only make sense when you can see the whole shape of them, not just the part where everything broke. Let me go back to the beginning. It was 2001, and I was 37 years old, living in Vancouver and working as a project coordinator for an environmental consulting firm. I had a 1-bedroom apartment in Kitsilano, a small savings account, a gym membership I used sporadically, and a very clear awareness that most of my university friends were already on their second child. My mother called every Sunday from her house in Fredericton, and every Sunday the conversation arrived at the same destination, through a slightly different route. My cousin had just had twins. My coworker's daughter, 29 years old, was engaged to a surgeon. My mother's book club had decided collectively that I was too selective. I was selective. I knew what I didn't want. I'd spent my late 20s and early 30s figuring that out with a series of relationships that each ended the same way, politely and with a general sense of mutual incompletion. I wanted someone who was real with me, who didn't perform, who talked about things that mattered instead of filling silence with noise. I just hadn't found that person yet. When my friend mentioned her colleague's brother, I almost said no. His name was Daniel. He was 35, worked in software development, lived in Calgary but traveled frequently to Vancouver for work. He had recently been diagnosed with relapsing-remitting multiple sclerosis, following a bad episode 2 years earlier. My friend said this carefully, watching my face. "He's managing well," she said. "He's not looking for a caregiver. He's just a bit tired of people treating him differently. Or not calling back after the 3rd date when they find out." I thought about that for a week before agreeing to meet him. Our first coffee was at a place on Granville Street on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was already there when I arrived, sitting with his hands around a mug, and he stood up carefully when he saw me, not with any obvious difficulty, just with a kind of deliberateness that I noticed and immediately told myself not to make a thing of. He was tall, dark-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of face that looked like it smiled easily. We talked for 3 hours. He was thoughtful. He asked real questions and waited for the real answers. He laughed at the right moments and went quiet at the right moments, and when I finally looked at my phone, I'd missed 2 calls from my mother and it was almost dark outside. Over the following months, I learned his rhythms. On good weeks he was fine, energetic, nearly indistinguishable from anyone else. On harder weeks, he moved more slowly. His hands weren't steady. He got exhausted after what seemed like nothing, and he'd cancel plans or shorten evenings with a quiet apology that never felt like an excuse. I told myself this was manageable. I told myself this was just life, and that every person came with their own version of difficulty, and that at least Daniel's version was honest and upfront. I fell in love with his honesty. That was the thing. He seemed incapable of pretending. He told me early on that his last serious relationship, with a woman named Karen, had ended when she found the MS too difficult to navigate. She'd said she hadn't signed up for this. He said it without bitterness, just a kind of resigned sadness that made me want to take that sadness away from him. I thought about Karen often after that. I found it almost incomprehensible that someone could walk away from a person they loved because that person had gotten sick. We dated long distance for 8 months, alternating visits between Vancouver and Calgary, before he asked me if I would consider moving. His neurologist was in Calgary. His mother and his brother were in Calgary. His support system was there, and uprooting it would be harder than it would be for me, whose company had a Calgary office and whose apartment lease was up for renewal anyway. I said yes. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was what you do when you're 38, and you've found the right person. We married the following spring in a small ceremony at a lodge outside Canmore. His mother cried when she gave the toast. My mother cried for reasons that included, I suspected, enormous relief. My sister Anne was my maid of honor, and she squeezed my hand during the vows and whispered that I'd never looked happier, which was true. In the first year of our marriage, I became an expert in things I had never expected to know. I knew which foods seemed to aggravate his fatigue. I knew how to modify a shower for bad days, which physiotherapist in the city took his benefits, which pharmacist would call us if a prescription was delayed. I learned what kind of silence meant he needed space, and what kind meant he needed company. I learned not to fuss, because he hated being fussed over, but to simply be available. I gave up the environmental consulting work because the hours were unpredictable and the travel was constant, and took a part-time administrative role at a non-profit instead. It paid less than half what I'd made before, but I told myself it was worth it. Daniel was always grateful, always attentive. He thanked me in small ways constantly, leaving notes, making the coffee before I woke up, remembering minor things I'd mentioned weeks earlier. On good days, he was the man I'd fallen in love with at that coffee shop on Granville. On hard days, I was a caregiver, and I was fine with that. I'd chosen this. I knew what I was choosing. I got pregnant 2 months after our second anniversary. We hadn't exactly been trying, but we hadn't not been trying either, which I suppose amounts to the same thing. When I told Daniel, he went very still for a moment, in the way he sometimes did when something hit him deeply, and then he pulled me into him and held on for a long time without saying anything. I assumed the silence was joy. I was right about that part, at least. The pregnancy was uncomfortable in the way all pregnancies seemed to be for people who believed, going in, that it would be something else. I was tired in a way that competed with Daniel's tired, which was a strange new experience, both of us needing help at the same time, neither of us very good at asking for it. His mother was over frequently. My sister flew out for a week in the second trimester. We were managing. I was 7 months along when it happened. I have replayed the moment in the hallway so many times over the years that it has taken on a quality slightly unreal, like a film clip I've watched too often. The split grocery bag, the oranges, Daniel bending easily, standing easily, his voice casual and warm, and then the few seconds before my brain assembled what had happened into something I could hold. I remember the sensation of my thoughts rearranging themselves, like when you look at one of those optical illusions and the image suddenly flips, and you can never quite get back to seeing it the first way. I said his name. He turned and looked at my face, and I watched something shift in his. A hesitation, a calculation, and then, terribly, something that looked like relief. "I need to tell you something," he said. Those words. I have heard other people describe moments of profound shock as going cold or going numb. For me, it was different. It was more like everything became very loud and very close. The sound of my own breathing, the orange still sitting against the baseboard, the winter light coming through the window at the end of the hall. He told me to sit down. I didn't sit down. He told me he had been planning to tell me before the baby came. I said nothing. He said the MS had never been real. He said the tremors were deliberate, the fatigue was performed, the neurologist appointments were real, appointments there simply had been nothing wrong to treat. He said he'd been seeing a general practitioner who had been a family friend and who had written referral letters that led nowhere because there was nothing to find. I asked him to stop talking. He kept talking. He said Karen hadn't left because of the MS. He said Karen had left because he had, in his words, nothing interesting to offer. He was a software developer who worked too many hours and talked too little, and had no patience for the social performances that relationships seemed to require. He said he had watched 2 of his colleagues go through devastating breakups, and one through a divorce, all following the pattern of someone attractive and capable, eventually concluding that the person they were with wasn't enough. He said his mother had suggested that what he needed was someone who would see past surfaces, someone who would stay. And the most reliable test of whether someone would stay was whether they would stay when things were hard. My voice came out very quiet when I finally spoke. "Your mother helped you plan this." He looked at the floor. She knew. A pause that contained, I would later understand, the second part of this particular destruction. "Yes." I asked him to leave. I said it 3 times before he went. He stood in the doorway of our house in the January cold without his coat, looking at me, and I said, "Get out," and he went. I called my sister. Anne answered on the second ring and knew immediately from my voice that something was catastrophically wrong. I told her in fragments, in a sequence that probably made no sense, and she listened without interrupting in the way that only people who genuinely love you can listen. She said she was booking a flight. I told her not to. She booked the flight anyway. When she arrived the following evening, I had not eaten properly or slept more than 2 hours. She found me at the kitchen table surrounded by what I could only describe as evidence 6 years of notes Daniel had left me, a folder of information I'd printed about MS relapses, a notebook where I'd tracked his good and bad days in case his doctors ever needed patterns. Anne sat across from me and looked at all of it and didn't say anything for a while. "He was never sick," I said. "Not one day of it was real." She put her hand over mine. "I gave up my career for him. I moved cities for him. I planned this entire life around a version of him that he invented. I know." And his mother sat in my house and watched me adjust my whole world around a lie she helped create. The following morning I called my own mother. I don't know exactly what I expected. Sympathy, outrage on my behalf, some uncomplicated solidarity. What I got was a silence that lasted several seconds too long before she said, carefully, that she'd always thought Daniel was a good person underneath everything, and that sometimes men did foolish things for complicated reasons, and that I was 7 months pregnant, which meant that whatever I decided, I needed to think about the baby first. I asked her if she had known. She said of course not, and she said it just a beat too quickly. I hung up. I sat with my hand on the phone for several minutes, feeling the specific vertigo of understanding that the people who were supposed to be most absolutely on your side had each, in their own way, failed to be. My sister stayed for 2 weeks. Daniel called every day. I didn't answer. He sent a letter, handwritten, 12 pages. Anne asked if I wanted her to read it first. I said no, and put it in the drawer unopened. His mother came to the door twice. The first time I didn't answer. The second time I opened the door and told her, with as much steadiness as I could manage, that she needed to leave and not come back until I contacted her. She looked stricken and older than I'd ever seen her. She said she had only ever wanted what was best for her son. I said I understood that, and that I also understood it had nothing to do with what was best for me, and I closed the door. My obstetrician referred me to a counselor she trusted. Her name was Dr. Morrison, a woman in her late 50s with an office near the Bow River and a quality of stillness that I found, in those first sessions, enormously stabilizing. I told her everything. She listened with the kind of attention that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, that the story I was telling made sense. "That was a profound betrayal," she said when I'd finished. "Your consent to this relationship, to these choices, was taken without your knowledge." "Yes. Exactly. That's exactly what it was," she nodded, "and I want to sit with that with you for a while. But I also want to ask you something, and I want you to know you don't have to answer it right now." She leaned forward slightly. "Before you found out when you thought Daniel had MS, what did you love about him?" "That's not a difficult question. He was thoughtful, honest. He really listened. He was never performative." Dr. Morrison held my gaze. "And how much of that, do you think, was shaped by the fact that he wasn't able to perform in the usual ways? He couldn't work long hours. He couldn't drag you to loud parties. He couldn't be the kind of high-energy, socially dominant man that tends to take up all the space in a relationship. He needed you to slow down, so you both slowed down. And in that slowness, you found the qualities you'd been looking for." I started to say that wasn't the same thing as loving him for being sick. And then I stopped. She wasn't saying I'd wanted him to be ill. She was saying something more unsettling than that I had been drawn, at 37 years old, to a version of a man that couldn't leave, couldn't compete with me, couldn't dismiss me, couldn't suddenly decide I wasn't enough. That I had organized my love around his limitation in ways I'd never examined. That the lie had allowed us both to be, in some ways, exactly who we needed to be, and that didn't excuse anything, but it was real, and worth looking at. I drove home from that session and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. My daughter was born 3 weeks after that conversation. The labor was long and not graceful, and at the end of it, the nurses placed her on my chest, and she was so entirely herself, so already completely a person, that I forgot for a few minutes about everything else. I had asked Anne to be there, and she was. Daniel was in the waiting room. I had not told him not to come. After they had cleaned her up and done whatever needed doing, the nurse asked me if there was anyone else I'd like in the room. I said my husband's name. He came in quietly, as he always had, and then I realized with a start that his quietness was no longer a symptom of anything, just who he was. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at our daughter, and his face was completely undone. He looked the way I had always hoped a person would look at something they loved beyond their own capacity to manage. "She's perfect," he said. He was crying, genuinely, unperformatively crying. We named her Simone. And she changed the mathematics of everything. Not immediately, not cleanly, but irrevocably. I did not take him back easily or quickly. I need to be clear about that. For 3 months after Simone was born, he slept in the spare room. We shared the work of her, the 3 a.m. feedings, the doctor's appointments, the endless inexplicable crying, but we were not together in any way I could define. He was competent with her in a way I hadn't expected, patient and careful and present in a manner that coexisted strangely with the fact that I was still furious at him most of the time. He answered every question I asked him in those months. I asked many. Did he ever laugh at me while I was tracking his supposed symptoms, adjusting our life around them? He said no. He said watching me do those things made him feel sick with guilt every single time, which was, he said, probably not the punishment I thought it was given that he let it continue anyway. I asked him why he didn't tell me the truth before the wedding. He said he'd told himself he would, repeatedly. He said he'd come close 3 or 4 times, and then told himself one more month. He needed just one more month to be sure. He said the cowardice had a momentum to it that he hadn't known how to stop. I asked if he'd ever loved me. He looked at me. He said yes. He said that the version of me I had been in those 6 years, careful, perceptive, willing to show up even when showing up was unglamorous, was someone he had loved more than he'd known how to say. He said that was perhaps the saddest part of what he'd done, that he'd found the real thing and then built a false structure around it because he hadn't trusted the real thing to hold. We went to therapy together for a 1.5 years. Dr. Morrison worked with both of us, sometimes separately, sometimes together. Daniel started his own individual therapy, working through whatever his mother had instilled in him that made deception feel like an act of self-protection. It was slow. There were sessions where I left angrier than I arrived. There were weeks when I told Anne on the phone that I didn't think I could do it, that the gap between who he'd pretended to be and who he actually was felt too wide to cross. His mother and I had one real conversation, about 8 months after Simone was born, at a coffee shop I chose, specifically because it was public. She looked older. She apologized not in the circular, self-protecting way she had at my door, but clearly and directly. She said she had watched Richard lose relationship after relationship and convinced herself that the problem was always the other person's shallowness, and that the solution was to remove the variables that revealed shallowness, and that she had never once considered what it would cost the woman on the other side of that experiment. She said it was the worst thing she had done, and she understood if I needed distance. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with her granddaughter, I had conditions. I was not going to be the quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law she'd assumed she was getting. I had opinions, and I would voice them. I had limits, and I expected them to be respected. And she was not to discuss any aspect of what had happened with Simone, ever, in any framing that cast it as something other than what it was, a manipulation I had not consented to. She agreed to all of it. She got a therapist. She didn't fight me on anything. It didn't make us close, but it made family occasions bearable, and for a long time that was all I needed. My mother was harder. She maintained for years that she hadn't known, and I chose eventually to accept that as probably true in the technical sense. She likely hadn't known the full extent. But she had known Daniel's mother, and she had understood that something about how we'd met had been orchestrated, and she had chosen not to ask questions. Our relationship has been careful ever since. Cordial. We visit at Christmas and talk every few weeks. Something between us narrowed in those years and never fully reopened. I've made my peace with that, mostly. Daniel and I did in the end find our way to something. It took longer than I'd hoped. It was uglier than any version of it I'd imagined in those early months when I was bargaining with the future. What we built was not the marriage I'd thought I was entering. That one had been built on a fiction, and the fiction was gone. But what replaced it was ours in a way that the original never quite had been. We argued properly now. We said things that were inconvenient and uncomfortable because we'd both been in enough therapy to understand the price of not saying them. We talked about the past when it needed to be talked about, and let it rest when it didn't. We had another child 3 years after Simone, a boy we named Oliver. He has Daniel's reading glasses and my stubbornness. Simone is married now, in Ottawa, with 2 small children and a career in urban planning. Oliver is finishing a graduate degree in Halifax. And Daniel and I are still in Calgary, in a smaller house now that it's just the 2 of us, with a backyard that gets more sun than the old one. We renewed our vows on our 20th anniversary. It was Simone's suggestion, actually, and something in me bristled at first. A second ceremony felt, I told her, like trying to prettify something that didn't need prettifying. She said she just thought her parents deserved a celebration. So we had one, small, in the backyard, in September, when the aspens were starting to turn. No performance of anything, just us and the people who had actually been there through all of it. Daniel spoke without notes. He said that the worst thing he had ever done had been done in the name of finding something real, which was its own particular kind of irony. He said that the real thing had been there from the beginning in the coffee shop on Granville Street, in the long-distance flights, in all of it, and that he had been too afraid to trust it, so he had surrounded it with a false structure that he thought would protect it. He said he understood now that the structure had nearly destroyed what it was meant to protect. He said he was still grateful, every day, that it hadn't. I spoke without notes, too. I said that I had spent a long time being angry at him for the lie, and a long time being angry at myself for not seeing it. And eventually I had been angry enough and tired enough that I had sat in Dr. Morrison's office one morning and asked her what came after anger. She had said, usually grief, and then, if you're lucky, just life. I told him I had grieved, and then I had chosen life. And I kept choosing it, even on the days when the old ghost of it surfaced, which it still did sometimes, a detail that would catch the light wrong and remind me of the years I'd organized around a condition that didn't exist, the career I'd stepped back from, the city I'd left, the particular loneliness of having been tested without knowing you were being tested. I'm 63 now. Simone's daughter is 3 years old and is asleep in the room down the hall while I write this. She is named Clara, after no one in particular, just because it was the name that fit her. She arrived in the world with the same quality of absolute self-possession that Simone had, and it still stops me sometimes, watching a new person discover that the world is larger than they knew. Do I forgive Daniel? Yes. Fully. Without condition. Though it took me years to get there, and I don't think I would have managed it without help. Do I understand what he did? In the way that you can understand something without excusing it, yes. He was a frightened person who found a frightened solution and didn't understand what it would cost until the bill arrived. That is not a character in a story. That is a person. Do I have regrets? Some days, yes. Some days I drive past the environmental consulting firm that had an office here, and I think about the version of my career that didn't get interrupted, and I feel a clean, specific grief for that. Some days I think about the year Simone was born, and remember how alone I felt. Alone, in a way that was different from ordinary loneliness, because it came from inside the thing that was supposed to protect you from it. Those days still come. They come less often. But then I think about the backyard in September. Daniel's face when he walked Simone down the aisle. Oliver calling to tell us he'd passed his defense. The 3 of us at Christmas last year. Simone and her husband and the baby, Oliver home from Halifax, Daniel and I in the kitchen making too much food the way his mother used to, and her mother used to before that. I think about the way Daniel talks now, really talks about the things that scared him, the choices he regrets, the work he has done to become someone he can recognize. He is not the quiet, careful, limited man I thought I'd married. He is something more complicated than that. He is someone I actually know. Dr. Morrison said something in one of our final sessions together, years after we'd first met. She said that the relationships that last are rarely the ones where nothing went wrong. They're the ones where people decided, after everything went wrong, to find out who they actually were to each other. She said that was a harder kind of love to arrive at, but also a more durable one. I think about that sometimes, when the morning is quiet and Daniel is in the kitchen and I can smell the coffee from the bedroom. I think about the hallway in January, the oranges on the floor, the world coming apart. I think about everything that came after, and I think, yes, This is the life I chose. Not the one I was handed, not the one I planned, not the one built on a careful and terrible lie, but this one. The one I kept choosing, on the bad days and the good ones, all the way here.